It is 1380, and you have just walked into a peasant's house. The first thing that hits you is not the dark, it is the smoke. A fire is burning in the middle of the floor on a bare clay pad. Look up for a chimney and there is nothing there. There will not be one in this building for another 200 years. The smoke climbs, spreads out under the roof, and leaves through the thatch. Your eyes sting, and you assume these people are poor. Nobody in that room could have told you the smoke was holding the house up. It was. It was also damaging their eyes and their lungs, and both of those things stayed true for 4 centuries. Today we walk through one of these houses the way you would have entered it. The fire that had nowhere to go, the roof living off it, the animals at the far end, and the one change that finally broke the room in half. 200 years after that evening, when the chimneys finally arrived, a clergyman named William Harrison wrote down what the old men in his village were saying about the change. They did not thank anybody. They said the smoke had been doing them good, and half of what they meant by that turns out to be correct. The rebuilding that took their old room apart is the end of this story. Start at the fire. Devon, England, in the 14th century. The house is one room, 30 feet long, maybe 15 wide, walls of woven rods packed with clay and dung, and a roof of thatch carried on curved timbers split from a single tree. There is a door in the long side and a second door facing it. That is the entire plan. The fire sits in the centre of that floor on a slab or a pad of beaten clay. It burns out in the open, on the ground, ringed with a few stones, and it does not go out. Ask why it is in the middle, and the answer is about money before it is about heat. A fire against a wall needs something to breathe through, and that means a flue, cut stone or brick, mortar, and a man who knows how to make one draw. In 1380, that is abbey work and castle work, priced accordingly. There is a second problem underneath the first. This house is made of wood, straw, and clay. Setting an open flame against a timber wall inside a building, roofed with dry reed, is the fastest way to lose everything you own before dawn. So the fire stays in the middle, as far from every wall as the room allows. It heats in all directions at once. It is the only light, so after dark the room arranges itself around it. It is the cooker, so the pot hangs above it on a chain. One fire is doing 3 jobs at once, in the single spot in the building where it is not going to kill anybody. The 2 doors matter more than they look. They face each other, and opening both turns the house into a wind tunnel on a breezy day, the same trick opposing doors do in a threshing barn. Shut them and the room holds its heat. That pair of doors is the only ventilation control the building has, and somebody worked it by hand all day, according to the weather. The fire itself was almost never lit from cold. At night it was banked, raked together and buried under its own ash, which starves it down to a core of embers that will still be alive at dawn. Starting again from nothing meant flint, steel and tinder, and somebody kneeling in the dark for a quarter of an hour. Nobody did that twice if they could help it. The fire is not a feature of this room. The room is what got built around the fire. None of this has to stay on a screen. If you would rather cut your own heating bill the old way, that is what the Medieval Home Savings Manual is for at the Medieval Way store. I will not mention it again. But while the fire did the obvious work down at floor level, something much stranger was going on 20 feet above it. Look up in here, and there is no ceiling. The room runs open all the way to the underside of the thatch. In a modern house, that volume would be a heating bill nobody would tolerate. In this one, it is the exhaust system. Smoke rises until it meets the roof, then spreads sideways and settles into a layer, held under the thatch the way water sits under ice. It does not fill the room from the floor upward, it fills it from the roof downward. Underneath that layer is a band of air that stays breathable, and it sits at about the height of a seated adult. That single fact explains the furniture. The benches are low, the table is low, the work of the English household happens low, and so does the sleeping. Reconstructed open hearth buildings at Weststow in Suffolk and at the Weald and Downland Museum in Sussex have been lit and occupied for exactly this reason, and the result repeats: stand up straight next to a live central fire and your head is in the smoke, sit down on a bench and you are beneath it. A room like this teaches you your own height very quickly, and it forces one enormous consequence on the building. You cannot floor over this space. Put a ceiling across the hall at head height, and the smoke has nowhere left to go, so it comes back down and the house becomes unusable within a week. The open roof space is a working part of the fire. The shape of the roof belongs to the same system. Thatch only sheds water if it is steep, somewhere near 50 degrees, because rain has to run off the surface of the reed instead of soaking into it. A pitch that's severe over a building 30 feet long encloses a very large volume of air up under the ridge. That was not decided for the smoke. It was decided for the rain, and the smoke inherited a reservoir big enough to swallow an entire evening of burning without ever pressing back down onto the people underneath. The two requirements happened to agree, and the household ended up with a chimney-sized cavity it never had to pay for. Most accounts of these houses stop at the discomfort. The question worth asking is what all that smoke was doing up in the roof for 400 years, because it was not idle. Start with the way it left. Some halls had a louver in the ridge, a slatted timber box set into the roof, sometimes with a shutter on a rope so the household could work it from below in bad weather. Some had a gap at the point of the gable. In the poorest buildings there was no opening at all, and the smoke percolated up through the thatch itself, coming off the roof on a cold morning like steam off a horse. Better houses reached a halfway stage called a smoke bay, a narrow slice of the building partitioned off and left open to the roof, with the fire at the bottom of it, so everything funneled up through one section instead of the whole hall. That is a chimney in every respect but the material, because it is built out of the same timber and plaster as the walls beside it. It is the step that shows the idea arriving before the money did. That last version sounds like failure. Reed and straw are dry plant matter, and a roof full of warm, damp smoke ought to be a roof that rots. The opposite happened, and the proof is still on the buildings. When old houses in southern England are stripped for re-roofing, the crews sometimes reach a bottom layer that is not like the thatch above it. It is black, greasy, compacted, and it is medieval. John Letts, working with English Heritage and the University of Reading in the 1990s, catalogued this surviving smoke-blackened thatch and identified it on roughly 250 buildings, some of it laid before Columbus sailed. The oldest of it has been sitting on those roofs for more than 500 years, under later thatch, unmaintained and unreplaced. Straw that should have rotted in a decade instead outlasted every family that lived beneath it. The real reason is the smoke that was supposedly the problem. Continuous warm smoke does three things to a roof at once. It keeps the material bone dry, so the fungi that break down plant fibre never get the moisture they need. It coats every stem and every rafter in tar and soot, which insects will not eat and cannot easily bore. And it keeps the whole roof space at a temperature where nothing wants to live. The medieval household was not tolerating the smoke on its way out of the building. The household was living inside a curing chamber, and the roof was the thing being cured. Once you see that, the rest of the room starts making sense. Bacon and hams went up into that smoke on hooks, high in the rafters, and came down months later still good. So did fish, and in some regions cheese. The bottom of the roof was a larder, and the fuel bill for it was zero, because the fire was burning anyway. It also explains a habit that looks like superstition from outside, which is the reluctance to let the fire die. A household that let it go out did not just lose warmth for a night. It lost the drying, the curing, and the protection on the roof, all of which depend on the smoke arriving continuously rather than in bursts. A fire kept alive for a generation is a maintenance contract on the building, paid in wood. Even the black thatch itself had a value at the end. Soot is rich in nitrogen. When a roof was finally stripped, the old smoke-blackened layer went onto the fields as fertilizer, and in parts of England it was worth enough that stripping a roof was a small event in the farming year. That is the honest case for the open hearth, and it needs an equally honest bill attached to it. Living in that air-damaged people, wood smoke carries fine particulates straight into the lungs, and eye irritation and chronic coughs are exactly what you would expect in a population that spent every winter evening inside a room with an open fire and no flue. Skeletal and documentary evidence for medieval respiratory illness is thin and hard to read, so nobody should pretend to a number here. But the mechanism is not in doubt, and the people in the room did not need a study. They could feel it. They stayed anyway for a reason that was not stupidity and was not poverty alone. The smoke came bundled with the heat, the light, the cooking, the curing, and the preserved roof, and there was no way to buy one part of that bundle without the others. The chimney did not exist as an option they were refusing. It existed as an option they could not reach, and they were sharing that air with more than each other. Walk to the far end of a Dartmoor longhouse and you do not find another bedroom. You find cattle. The classic longhouse ran the whole household under one roof in a single line. People at the upper end, a cross passage through the middle with a door on either side, and the buyer at the lower end, built deliberately downslope with a drain cut into the floor so waste ran away from the living space. Guy Beresford's excavations at Houndtor on Dartmoor in the 1960s uncovered these buildings and their drains in the abandoned village there, and the layout is unambiguous. The animals lived down the far end of the room you slept in, behind a low partition and nothing else. Sentiment had very little to do with it. A cow gives off heat continuously, day and night, for free, and it does it hardest in the months when the household needs it most. Livestock kept indoors are also livestock. Nobody can drive off in the dark, which mattered enormously in a world where a stolen ox was the loss of your ploughing for a year. Housing them under the same roof also saved the household a wall it would otherwise have paid for twice. And the traffic went both ways. The buyer end got the tail of the smoke, which is a mild disinfectant and a serious deterrent to flies, and the cattle got a building that was already warm. The arrangement was warm and it was foul, and everybody involved knew both halves of that. This was never universal. The longhouse belongs to the wetter, hillier west and north, to Devon, Cornwall, Wales, Ireland and Cumbria, and in much of lowland England the animals had their own building, and the peasant house was just the hall. What travels everywhere is the underlying logic. Nothing in this house exists for its own sake, and anything that produces heat is kept where the heat lands on people. Take the cattle back out of the picture and the room gets stranger because of how little is left in it. There is no glass in the windows. The word itself is the Old Norse for wind-eye, and that is what they are. Openings, closed with a hinged shutter or a slatted frame, sometimes with a stretched oiled cloth, or a thin scraped hide to let in a dull light without the weather. Glass exists in 1380. It is in churches because that is where the money is. There is almost no furniture. A chest because everything of value gets locked in it. A trestle table, which is boards on frames and comes apart the moment the room is needed for something else. Benches. A bed that is more often a sack of straw than a frame. Almost none of it is permanent, and that is the point. Everything in here is either portable or consumable, because in a house where the roof timbers might get reused twice and the walls need patching every few years, the durable wealth of the household sits in the animals, the tools, the chest, and the pot. Fire, damp, and a bad harvest can all take the building. None of them can take an ox. You can walk out the door. That is the room, complete. One fire, one open roof, one band of clean air, a byre at the end, and a family living in the middle of it, and the whole arrangement stable for something like 400 years. Then it ended inside about 70. W. G. Hoskins, the historian who first mapped what came after, called that period the Great Rebuilding, and it did not begin with an architect. It began with a mason and a stack of bricks. In 1577, a clergyman named William Harrison published a description of England that included a passage about what the old men in his own village kept telling him. 3 things, they said, had changed beyond recognition in their lifetimes. The furniture had improved. The wooden plates had turned into pewter. And there were chimneys everywhere now, where in their young days a village might have had 2 or 3, and those belonged to the manor and the church. Then Harrison records the part almost nobody quotes. The old men were not celebrating. They complained. The smoke, they said, had hardened the timber of the house, and it had kept the family from coughs and colds, and they were harder men for having lived in it. Half of that is folklore. The other half is correct, and they had watched it be correct for their whole lives, because the roofs they grew up under were still standing. The chimney arrived, and it worked. It took the smoke out of the room, and it took it out fast, and no household that got one ever went back. But it did something to the building that nobody appears to have planned for. Once the smoke is going up a stack against a wall, the open roof space is no longer doing a job. It is just volume. And volume you are not using is a floor you have not built yet. So they built it. Across roughly 1570 to 1640, hall after hall in the English countryside had a chimney stack driven up through the middle of it, and a floor laid across at head height, and the single open room became a house of 2 stories with separate rooms inside it. It gave people bedrooms and doors that shut, and privacy that arrived as a side effect of ventilation rather than as anybody's plan. The chimney did not just clear the air, it ended the room. The arrangement where an entire household, servants included, ate and slept in one space in the sight of one fire did not get argued away. It got floored over. You can go and check this yourself, and it is the best trick in the whole subject. Go into any old building with exposed roof timbers and look at the rafters above where a ceiling now sits. If those timbers are black, and the black is a hard tarry crust soaked into the grain rather than paint, you are looking at the ceiling of a medieval open hall. That soot could only land while there was a fire below and no chimney to take it away, so it stopped the moment the stack went in. It is a date stamp, and you can read it from the ground with a torch. 2 details confirm it. The blackening usually stops abruptly at the level of the inserted floor, and it is heaviest at the ridge where the smoke sat longest. Find a beam that is sooty on top and clean underneath, and you have found the exact line where one way of living was sealed off from the other. There are thousands of those roofs still in use, holding up bedrooms belonging to people who have no idea their attic used to be full of bacon. Subscribe if you want the buried version of history. What surprised you most? The roof, the cattle, or the chimney? Until next time, build to last.